March 10, 1945. Tokyo was still sleeping under clear skies. At 0:08, the darkness was broken by bright dots that descended in silence. But that was not light. It was the beginning of the largest firestorm ever caused by man. General Tojo, months earlier, had declared that the Japanese soul would withstand any American bomb. That belief did not survive the dawn. The attack that would follow was not a miscalculation nor an operational exaggeration. It was an experiment, a surgical application of science, engineering, and industry on a city built of wood. It was no longer a trench war or a war of honor. It was an efficiency equation, amount of napalm per square meter, number of bombs per urban mile, heat capacity versus population density. And it worked with alarming accuracy. This video recounts, in detail, the night Tokyo turned to ashes. It shows the contrast between the moral values that Japan defended and the cold logic that the United States applied. It reveals how an industrial superpower reduced an imperial capital to ruins in a few hours, and why this episode, as lethal as Hiroshima, was silenced by time. It was not an atomic bomb. It was something even more efficient. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any speech. In a single night, 279 American planes dropped 1,765 tons of incendiary bombs on the capital of Japan. The result, 100,000 dead, 267,000 buildings erased from the map, and more than 1 million civilians displaced in just 6 hours. No atomic bombs were used, no international treaty was violated, and yet the world hardly talks about it. This is the story of the deadliest air operation of World War II, marked not by radiation but by temperature. 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit over a city of wood and paper. If you value facts that history has tried to hide and believe that the past needs to be understood with rigor and memory, leave your like and subscribe. This helps the channel to continue revealing truths that time has almost erased. When the first B-29 superfortresses crossed the skies of the Pacific in mid-1944, the American expectation was clear. Surgical precision at 30,000 feet, military targets destroyed without hitting civilians, and technological superiority consolidated by altitude. It was the pinnacle of the doctrine of strategic bombing, an idea born in the 1930s when generals believed that air power alone, if used well, could break the backbone of any economy. But Japan had a peculiar problem. Unlike Germany, its industry was diluted in small residential neighborhoods. Home workshops produced components for airplanes, radios, and ammunition. There were no giant factories to be eliminated, but thousands of small fires lit in the middle of a wooden forest. What's more, the Japanese skies didn't cooperate. The jet stream, was not a theory, but a brutal force that destroyed the accuracy of bombing. Winds of more than 300 km/h displaced the bombs for miles. 60% of the attacks launched from China missed the mark completely. The radars, still primitive, did not compensate for the absence of visibility, and the constant clouds made visual releases useless. Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Air Force, was beginning to feel the pressure. The promise to bend Japan with aerial bombardments seemed up to that point a technical and doctrinal fantasy. He had bet billions of dollars on the creation of the B-29, a machine that cost more than the Manhattan Project itself. But reality imposed itself. Flying high was elegant. Winning the war, however, would require something more brutal. The Germans, for their part, watched the arrival of the B-29s with a mixture of skepticism and intellectual superiority. For the Luftwaffe, the air war was won with fighters, cannons, and morale. But the numbers said something else. In 1944, while Germany produced 34,000 aircraft, the United States manufactured more than 96,000. And more than producing, they delivered. That same year, The US built 93 aircraft carriers, 24,000 tanks, 640,000 jeeps, and 41 billion rounds. War had become a matter of surrender, not doctrine. A B-29 took months to develop, but it left Boeing factories at a rate of 4 units a day. It was a machine that incorporated full pressurization, computer-controlled turrets, and a range of more than 5,000 kilometers, all while operating at 31,000 feet, unreachable for most enemy fighters. The Germans, still confident in medium bombers and pinpoint interceptors, could not keep up with the scale. By 1943, when the Luftwaffe still believed it could contain the Allied air offensive, American production of aircraft engines was already 5 times greater than German capacity. The statistic that many ignored: for every ton of bomb dropped by Germany, the United States would drop 17. If you were surprised by this, comment below. Logistics wins. In the Pacific, this advantage was not just numerical, it was organizational. The engineering of air bases in the Mariana Islands was, in itself, an unprecedented logistical feat. Thousands of CBs, the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, built runways of more than 2,000 meters in Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in record time. Equipment, fuel, and ammunition crossed the ocean aboard ships supplied by a national production network that had never been attacked. Each B-29 air mission was fueled by an ecosystem of 600,000 American workers on the ground. And even so, the results were still disappointing. Bombardments of Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, carried out at high altitude, caused little damage. On a mission over Yawata, only 15% of the bombs fell within 1,000 meters of the target. The system was not working as promised. The doctrine of precision was broken down in the face of Japanese geography, meteorology, and industrial decentralization. It was in this context that the first tensions between command and strategy emerged. General Haywood Hansell, a staunch defender of the doctrine of accurate bombing, remained faithful to the manuals, but his failure to generate tangible results began to erode his credibility. In Washington, Arnold no longer accepted technical excuses. He needed numbers, not theory. In January 1945, the replacement came with name and accent: Curtis Emerson LeMay, a commander known for his coldness, his results, and his willingness to break dogmas. LeMay did not believe in operational elegance. He believed in destructive efficiency. War for him was mathematics, and the Japanese equation needed new variables. Meanwhile, Japan remained convinced that the war would be won by spiritual resistance. The concept of Gyokusai, the honor of dying as a broken jewel, still dominated public discourse, but reality was silently approaching. Every time a B-29 failed, it learned. Each mission recorded winds, temperatures, defensive patterns. Americans treated every failure as raw data to be refined. And while Germany clung to untested jet fighters and promises of secret weapons, the United States did what it knew how to do best: scale up production, adjust methods, repeat it more forcefully. In Tokyo, few knew that the February fires were just tests. The weather reports were being cross-referenced with the urban layout. The engineers already knew the materials of the houses, the predominant direction of the wind, and the depth of the urban canals. The city had become a mathematical target. But something was still missing. A decision was missing that would break the last vestige of aerial idealism. He lacked the courage to abandon precision and embrace fire in its crudest form. There was a lack of a commander willing to turn high-tech bombers into platforms of incendiary destruction, and that decision would be made soon. The next installment will reveal how Curtis LeMay, pencil in hand and a map of Tokyo on his desk, redrew what it meant to win a war from heaven. Curtis LeMay arrived in the Pacific with a map of Tokyo in his hand and a conviction in mind. The war would not be won by elegant ideas, but by measurable results. Upon assuming command of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945, he encountered a frustrated Air Force operating at ineffective altitudes, guided by doctrines that stood only on paper. Accuracy at 30,000 feet had failed. Targets escaped under thick clouds. Winds displaced bombs for miles, and damage reports showed month after month that Japan continued to produce, resist, survive. LeMay saw no glory at altitude. He saw waste, and so he made a decision that would change air warfare forever. The B-29s would stop flying like high-performance eagles and start operating like flying furnaces, pouring fire at low altitude on residential areas. The first order was simple and devastating. Withdraw all defensive machine guns except the rear. This allowed the bomb load to be doubled. Then it redesigned the route of the missions, prioritizing night and individual flights, eliminating the traditional block formations. Each bomber would be its own mission. The logic was brutally clear. Japanese fighters were few, without night radar, poorly trained, and operating at 1,500 meters high reduced mechanical failures and increased accuracy. The concept of precision bombing was replaced by rationalized mass destruction. LeMay, an engineer in thought, treated the city as a combustible system. He knew that Tokyo neighborhoods, such as Shitamachi, were made up of wooden structures, separated by narrow alleys. He knew that specific winds created natural tunnels for fire to spread, and he knew that if he concentrated enough napalm in a single area, the fire itself would do the job. The goal was not to hit industrial targets, it was to turn the neighborhood itself into a weapon against itself. On paper, it was mathematics. In practice, it would be a firestorm. When asked about the morality of the plan, he replied, "War is immoral. The faster we finish, the better." That was no longer a precision strategy. It was a doctrine of saturation. Each B-29 would carry 40 cluster bombs, each with 38 M69 submunitions, containing aluminum-stabilized napalm. In all, more than 1,500 incendiary devices per plane. The plan was as ruthless as it was logical. LeMay did not hide his coolness. For him, a well-placed fire did more damage to the Japanese war machine than a year of conventional bombing. His frankness impressed even his superiors. Henry Arnold, who commanded the U.S. Air Force, approved the change without hesitation. The pressure for results spoke louder than any code of honor, and Japan had no idea what was coming. Japanese intelligence reports still operated under the expectation of precision strikes, factories, arsenals, targets of immediate military value, but the Americans had rewritten the rules. The city as a whole was now the target. LeMay knew what that meant. In his memoirs, he wrote, "If we had lost the war, I would probably have been tried as a criminal." He did not exaggerate. The new doctrine abolished any distinction between civilian and military. The objective was to break the capacity for resistance by destruction, by trauma, by urban paralysis. Planners called it a systems view. The executioners of total tactics. And when the plan was presented to the General Staff, no one questioned it. The logic was unassailable. Projections showed that in a single night it would be possible to burn down to 40% of the urban area of Tokyo, and the most disturbing, with minimal losses. The B-29s, now lighter, would be faster and more efficient. The Japanese, on the other hand, had no way to defend themselves. The network of night fighters was scarce, the spotlight was few, and anti-aircraft artillery designed for targets at altitude would be almost useless against bombers flying at 1,800 meters. Japan was not only unprepared, it was doomed by its own doctrine. Meanwhile, in Germany, the High Command was still discussing the effectiveness of the Me-262s and the feasibility of tactical counterattacks. But they ignored the essentials. While a fighter jet required months to produce and tens of liters of fuel per minute, the United States was producing jet fuel at a rate of 500,000 barrels per day. and the B-29s no longer needed to be intercepted. They would fly below the radar. The war had changed, and no one from the Axis seemed to understand this. Japan would not know until midnight that LeMay's logic was not theoretical. It would soon be tested over the most populous city on the planet. The fire, unlike the bomb, would not be launched all at once. It would fall gradually, like rain, a rain that would evaporate 15,000 hectares in less than 6 hours. The next part will reveal how engineering turned this doctrine into execution. The millimeter selection of the target, the drawing of the X on fire over Tokyo, and the preparation of the heavens for one of the deadliest nights in human history. Operation Meeting House was not born out of a war room, but out of laboratories, testing grounds, and planning sessions where engineers used rulers instead of rifles. Long before the first B-29 took off, scientists at the Chemical Warfare Service had already built life-size replicas of Japanese neighborhoods in the Utah desert. At the Dugway Proving Ground, an entire city made of wood, rice paper, tatami mats, and sliding doors was erected only to be destroyed. The tests aimed to answer an objective question: which incendiary formula was most effective against Tokyo homes? The results showed that traditional white phosphorus was too volatile, magnesium burned too fast, and thermite, while potent, lacked adhesion. The answer came from the combination of 3 institutions: Harvard University, Standard Oil, and DuPont. Together, they developed napalm, a gelatinous mixture of gasoline and metal thickeners that clung to any surface and burned at more than 1,800 degrees. The new weapon, named M69, was a steel cylinder 50 centimeters long, 7 centimeters in diameter, and about 3 kilos in weight. Inside it, the napalm was activated by a charge of white phosphorus and spread over a radius of up to 30 meters. But most important was its delayed ignition mechanism. A 3 to 5 second fuse allowed the bomb to penetrate structures and lie down before exploding, maximizing the thermal impact inside buildings. Each E-46 cluster bomb carried 38 of these submunitions, and each B-29, in its new lightweight configuration, could carry up to 40 clusters. The math was straightforward. More than 1,500 ignition sources per plane. Multiplied by 279 operational aircraft on that mission, the number exceeded 424,000 incendiary devices. It was no longer a question of bombing a city, it was a matter of transforming it into fuel. While Germany bet on bunkers and fixed anti-aircraft defenses, the Americans bet on climate and urban density. The Office of Strategic Services, the CIA's predecessor, cross-referenced data from population censuses, household production records, and Japanese urban planning maps. The ideal target was identified, the Shitamachi district in eastern Tokyo. There, in just 40 square kilometers, more than 750,000 people lived. It was a working-class zone, with narrow streets, houses glued together, and tens of thousands of small family workshops, exactly the kind of decentralized production that underpinned Japanese aviation. The urban layout created the perfect setting for the spread of chain fires. Based on this, Air Force meteorologists were called in to identify the ideal window: constant winds, low humidity, clear skies, and updrafts. The forecast pointed to the night of March 9th to 10 as the perfect opportunity. The speed of the surface winds, between 25 and 45 km/h, would guarantee the formation of an effect known as a firestorm, in which the flames feed on the surrounding oxygen with such intensity that they create wind vortices and temperatures capable of melting metals. Nothing was left to chance. The flight plan was designed for the B-29s to enter Japanese airspace individually, without training, avoiding radar, and splitting defenses. The first aircraft, called Pathfinders, would carry M47 bombs with napalm and phosphorus, whose function was simple: to draw on the ground, with fire, a gigantic X visible from the sky. This marker would be the reference point for the other bombers. The altitude was set between 1,500 and 2,100 meters. The target, unlike previous missions, was no longer a military installation, but the urban fabric itself. LeMay and his team knew that a city made of wood, under the right conditions, would not hold out for minutes, and science confirmed it. Thermal studies conducted by the National Defense Research Committee showed that with the right density of incendiary devices, about 1 by 9 square meters, it would be possible to generate a self-sustaining fire. That is, a burn that would spread without the need for continuous bombardment. It was a strategy of ignition, not destruction by impact. Unlike conventional bombs, which rely on explosion and fragmentation, the M69 specialized in thermal persistence. It didn't just start the fire, she fed him. In Germany, the closest technical response was the B-1E Incendiary bomb, used by the Luftwaffe in London. But it was magnesium-based and less effective in wide areas. In addition, production was limited by the shortage of aluminum and fuel. In 1945, the US produced 50,000 tons of napalm per month. Japan, in this same period, struggled to maintain basic kerosene production. The disparity was abysmal. Japan still believed that its national spirit could withstand any attack. But the American machine wasn't aiming at the spirit. It was aiming for oxygen. LeMay's plan, unlike German air terror strategies, was clinical, almost impersonal. There was no intention to shock. There was an intention to end the war. Each step of the operation was based on data, graphs, statistical patterns. The enemy was treated as a thermal system, not as a people. Precision was not geographical, it was mathematical. At the end of the preparation, the final report presented to Arnold estimated that, if the weather conditions were confirmed, up to 40% of the target zone would be incinerated in less than 4 hours. The projection seemed exaggerated, but it would prove to be conservative. In Tokyo, no one knew. Air raid sirens were already sounding frequently enough not to cause alarm, and previous high-altitude bombing had done little damage. The population believed it was safe. Until then, there was still no reason to think differently. The city did not know that on the runways of Tinian, Saipan and Guam, the R-3350 engines were already being warmed up. Each plane had been loaded beyond rated capacity. The bombs were ready, and the sky clear. In the next part, the viewer will see how the contrast between this meticulous planning and the Japanese defense structure created an absolute imbalance. When logic meets improvisation, the result is not confrontation, it is collapse. In Japan in 1945, air defense was not a system, it was a patchwork. Divided between the Army and Navy without centralization of command, the country operated 2 parallel defense networks that did not talk to each other. The Army Air Force had obsolete fighters that were poorly adapted to night flight. Naval aviation, on the other hand, maintained interceptors with severe technical limitations. Without onboard radar equipment, most Japanese aircraft operated blindly at night, relying solely on visual search, handheld searchlights, and sound listening towers, methods that had already become obsolete by the start of the war. The main night fighter, the Nakajima J1N1S Gecko, was a rushed adaptation of a reconnaissance aircraft equipped with 20mm oblique cannons firing upwards at an angle. In theory, it should surprise the bombers from below. In practice, it flew slowly, with limited range, and only 479 units were produced in the entire war. The second defensive pillar, the Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, was more robust, but suffered from unreliable engines and maintenance difficulties. By March 1945, estimates indicated that fewer than 200 night fighters were operational on all of the Japanese home islands. Even these flew with severe restrictions. Fuel was rationed, training flight hours were minimal, and the pilots, young and inexperienced, were not prepared to fight bombers at medium altitudes in complete darkness. Tokyo, a city of more than 4 million people, was defended by fewer than 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns, mostly of the 88mm Type 88 model, whose rate of fire was low and whose effectiveness depended on visual coordinates. None of them were integrated with modern radar systems. Japan, unlike Germany, had not invested in electromechanical fire control systems. It relied on binoculars, compasses, and human estimates. On cloudy nights, the effectiveness dropped to 0. On clear nights, such as March 9th, visibility was good, but the sky was empty. The B-29s would fly lower than normal, out of the ideal range of heavy artillery, and too fast for ill-equipped night fighters. Civil defense, in turn, was a symbolic structure. There were only 18 concrete shelters in all of Tokyo, capable of accommodating about 90,000 people. The rest of the population protected themselves in improvised holes in the ground, covered by boards and straw. The city's 8,000 firefighters used hand pumps, buckets, ladders, and coal-fired cars. Their equipment was designed for house fires, not firestorms. Most neighborhood associations were made up of civilians, the elderly, women, and adolescents, armed with buckets of sand and small portable water pumps. They were brave, but they were alone. Drinking water systems could not withstand great pressures, and pumping stations were vulnerable to any power outage. In emergency drills, civilians were taught how to put out incendiary bombs with wet blankets. No instruction talked about napalm, and none foresaw the simultaneity of hundreds of thousands of fires spread over kilometers, fed by the wind. Still, most Tokyo residents believed they were safe. The reason was simple. Until then, the bombings had been inaccurate and isolated. High-altitude daytime flights had hit industrial targets with little effectiveness. Sirens have become part of the routine. Many were no longer sheltering, others didn't even wake up. There was a widespread feeling that the worst was over, but the worst had not even begun yet. While the Japanese structure collapsed, the Americans operated with redundancy. If one radar failed, there were 3 others. If one plane aborted, there were 300 others. The bombers followed with precision by Lauren radio beacons, navigation systems developed based on synchronized radio waves that allowed positioning even in total darkness. While the Japanese relied on sound, the Americans worked with atomic chronometers. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. But Japanese doctrine still insisted on bravery and endurance as defense mechanisms. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more detailed content forgotten by history. The result of this mismatch would be brutal. By the time the B-29s flew over Tokyo, the spotlight would be turned to the wrong place. The fighters would be on the ground, without fuel, and the artillery, calibrated to 9,000 meters, would find targets flying at 1,500. It was like trying to hit a train with a shotgun. The Japanese technicians knew about the flaws, but the warnings were drowned out by a vertical command system where admitting weakness was dishonorable. The belief was that the people would resist, but that night, not even the people would know where to run. The evacuation routes, drawn up years earlier, did not predict fire coming from all sides. The canals, considered refuge areas, would become thermal traps. And shelter centers, such as schools and temples, would be the first to collapse with the temperature. Tokyo would not fall for lack of courage. It would fall for lack of faith in a structure that no longer existed. Meanwhile, on the American side, the plan went on like a synchronized gear. Each crew knew what to do, each bomb was numbered, each map updated. The contrast was absolute. It was the war between statistics and intuition, between method and hope. And when the first bomber flew over Tokyo Bay, there would be no siren that could predict what was coming. In the next part, the viewer will see how the B-29s, lightened of weight, turned into incendiary cargo machines, and how every detail of the plane was adapted not to survive, but to burn efficiently. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was not just a bomber. It was the flying portrait of American industrial supremacy. The result of a direct investment of $3 billion, more than the entire Manhattan Project, the B-29 was conceived as a total war platform, designed from the first to operate over intercontinental distances with unprecedented precision, autonomy, and cargo volume. Each aircraft contained more than 55,000 individual parts produced in more than 500 factories across the United States. The wings came from Kansas, the engines from Michigan, the pressurization systems from California, the automated shooting towers from Texas, and everything was assembled in gigantic factories, such as the Wichita plant, where 28,000 workers operated in 3 uninterrupted shifts. The plane measured 30 meters in length, had a wingspan of 43 meters, and weighed 60 tons fully loaded. But its heart was the Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone radial engine, an 18-cylinder beast with more than 2,200 horsepower. 4 of them were pushing the B-29 at more than 570 km/h, at altitudes of up to 9,000 meters. It was the world's first bomber with pressurized cockpits, internal corridors for crew to move during flight, and a computerized center sight system that remotely controlled all defensive turrets. These turrets, guided by gyroscopes and optical sighting, allowed a single gunner to control multiple 50 guns. It was air warfare transformed into precision architecture. While Japan assembled interceptors with plywood parts and fabric coverings, the United States produced inline bombers with an engineering tolerance of less than 2 millimeters. In 1944, 4 B-29s were leaving the factories per day. The supply chain that sustained this pace crossed the continent. Railroad lines transported parts between 17 states. Specialized trucks carried engines packed in wooden boxes with thermal absorption. Each plane needed 5,000 gallons of high-performance jet fuel, plus 120 gallons of synthetic oil, ammunition, bombs, and an 11-man crew. And all of this was delivered accurately, week after week, on the islands of Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, more than 10,000 kilometers from the American mainland. Every 3 days, a supply ship docked in the Marianas. The logistics were as precise as the bombing. Each airbase had its own airfield, workshop system, parts depots, and maintenance hangars. The structure of Tinian Island included 2 2,600-meter runways, a radar control tower, and a military railway terminal that transported bombs from the depot to the aircraft. It was a flying city built in the middle of the ocean. The training of the crews also reflected this scale. At airfields in Texas, Colorado, and Nebraska, tens of thousands of men were trained in simulators, navigational tests, defensive shooting, technical emergencies, and precision bombing protocols. Each radar operator had to master more than 300 procedures. Each navigator received instruction on detailed Japanese topographic maps, marking train lines, rivers, neighborhoods, and even school zones. Pilots were trained in just 6 months, but with a daily flight load and intensive use of veteran instructors. No other country, until that moment, had managed to train and operate an air force with such sophistication. Germany, with its fields bombed and resources collapsing, was training pilots with less than 20 hours of flight time. Japan, in 1945, was already training teenagers with gliders before putting them in unarmed fighters. Meanwhile, the United States built, fueled, and sent bombers with more technology than many countries had put into the air throughout the war. The most impressive thing, however, was not the airplane. It was the system. The B-29 was just the final link in an industrial chain that began in the bauxite mines of Arkansas and ended at a burning target on the other side of the Pacific. Nothing was improvised. Everything was standardized, timed, calibrated. Japan still believed that it could win by the strength of the spirit, by the resistance of the people, by the morale of the struggle. But what was coming from heaven wasn't just power, it was method. The difference between a Japanese attack with zero was courage. The difference between an American attack with B-29 was statistics. Each flight took into account wind, humidity, atmospheric pressure, urban density, roof covering material, estimated evacuation time, and fire spread rate. It was not war as combat. It was war as an applied science. Total production of the B-29 over the course of the war was 3,970 units, and only a fraction of them were needed to erase a city like Tokyo. This is because, contrary to what many imagined, the plane no longer needed to survive a mission. He needed to complete the mission, and the mission had changed. The B-29, which had been born as a precision bombing platform, had become an aerial ignition system. The design remained the same, but his function had been reprogrammed, and this reprogramming would be put to the test on the night of March 9th, 1945. The next part will reveal, step by step, how the B-29 engines gained power on that silent night, and how the first squadron traced in the sky the beginning of a fire that would leave Hiroshima silent. At 5:35 p.m. on March 9, 1945, the first B-29 began rolling on the runway at North Field Base on Tinian. The sound was dry and continuous, 4 Wright R-3350 engines roaring under the weight of more than 6 tons of incendiary bombs. The aircraft was picking up speed on an airfield built only months earlier, leveled by thousands of tons of concrete and gravel brought in by cargo ships from the United States. That night, 334 bombers were ready. Of these, 279 would continue to the target. Each one flying alone, no training, no escort, no radio. The new doctrine provided that dispersion was safer than mass. And each pilot had clear instructions. Follow a navigation point marked with millimeter precision, cross the Japanese coast at the exact time, and drop his death charge on a target already lit by the flames of the Pathfinders. At 6:10 p.m., the second wave departed. Then the third, and so on, in a constant stream of metallic colossi that took to the Pacific sky with engines at the limit of power. Most planes took off at 95% of maximum capacity, enough to force the structures, but within the calculated risk. The heat in the engines was monitored by ground engineers until the last second. The propellers cut through the wind with precision, and once in the air, silence settled in the cabin, broken only by the sound of synchronized clocks. It was the largest air mission ever planned against a single city. During the flight, each crew followed a carefully timed route. The ocean seemed motionless under its wings. There was no radio communication except in extreme cases. Navigation was done by LORAN radio steering, crossing signal stations in the Pacific, with maps calculated for tolerance of less than 500 meters. On the horizon, after 5 hours of flight, the dark outline of Mount Fuji appeared. It was the definitive milestone. The line of fire was close. The Pathfinders, assigned to arrive first, crossed the coast at 11:30 p.m. They flew at low altitude, carrying M47 bombs with white phosphorus, designed not to destroy, but to ignite. His goal was to draw a gigantic X over the Shitamachi neighborhood, the point of greatest urban, economic, and population density in Tokyo. Within minutes, the flaming symbol could already be seen from miles away. The target was marked, and the route defined. Behind them, the rest of the B-29s followed in silence. Some planes cut off the exterior lights. Others kept only minimal navigation. The sky was clear, the wind currents were soft, and the air humidity is low, an ideal condition for the spread of napalm. The Japanese defense did not respond. The sirens began to sound too late, and the spotlights swept the sky looking for formations that didn't exist. The new tactic of the Americans eliminated any pattern. The planes came from varying angles, at staggered times, at oscillating altitudes. For the gunners on the ground, there was no way to anticipate the attack, and for radars, the volume was too low to warrant widespread alarm. In less than 15 minutes, the first group dropped their bombs. The charges were opened at an altitude of 600 meters, and the M69 spread out in a dispersion pattern that had been calculated in the laboratory. 38 submunitions per cluster, each hitting the ground a few seconds late, activating the napalm with a dry, non-exploding sound. The city began to catch fire in silence. The flames grew before the sound arrived. From above, the crews saw flames multiplying like roots of an underground fire. The residential zones made of wood and paper responded exactly as the engineers predicted. The first houses were consumed in less than 60 seconds. The narrow streets became channels of fire. The roofs collapsed before the residents could even reach the stairs. By this time, more than 100 B-29s were over the city, each one dropping their load at defined points. LeMay's plan was a cog, and it was working with surgical precision. The fire was not just a result, it was the goal itself. Every minute, 10 more aircraft crossed the sky, maintaining a steady flow of napalm, warming the air, collapsing the pressure, intensifying the firestorm effect. Oxygen began to disappear from ground level. The hot air rose in columns of more than 300 meters, and the fire itself pulled more wind into the city. It was what American meteorologists had predicted. A self-powered thermal storm. Inside the pressurized cabs, the operators saw the orange glow spread in lines, then in circles, then in continuous patches. Tokyo burned like a blade heated from the center. The bombing instructions were not random. Each sector of the city was divided into priority zones, and the following waves went to the outer sectors, increasing the perimeter of destruction. The goal was to force logistical collapse and prevent any attempt at containment. The city's water system collapsed in less than 40 minutes. The pressure dropped, the hand pumps failed, and the canals which once served as escape routes have been transformed into steam ovens, cooking alive those who jumped for cover. Within an hour, more than 15 square kilometers were on fire. Japan still did not understand what was happening. Intelligence reports, intercepted after the war, show that officers believed they were under multiple separate attacks due to the irregularity of the pattern. Some suggested that the Americans had used gas, others that they were incendiary mines planted by spies. No one imagined that it was the result of a single logistics system operating more than 10,000 kilometers away with the precision of a Swiss watch. In the next part, we'll look at what happened on the ground. Like firefighters, civilians and children tried to escape hell, and why, at that moment, the city itself became a weapon against its inhabitants. At an altitude of just over 1,800 meters, the sound of the bomb bay's opening was drowned out by the constant roar of the engines. Each B-29 dropped dozens of E-46 clusters, and each of those clusters opened like a steel flower 150 yards off the ground, releasing 38 freefall M69 bombs. The descent was silent. There was no immediate explosion. Only the dry impact against the wooden roofs, followed by an almost choreographed sequence of ignitions. The streets of the Shitamachi district, in a matter of seconds, were taken over by fires that multiplied with the wind. Residents came out of their homes believing it was another bombing like the previous ones, but the temperature soon corrected them. The flames were not coming from one direction, they were coming from all. The heat was so intense that it melted the soles of shoes and inflamed the fabrics of clothes with simple proximity. Children were seen running with their feet burned, screaming for names that were lost in the sound of crackling wood. Firefighters tried to act, but their equipment, buckets, hand hoses, flimsy ladders, was consumed before any containment was possible. A group of civilians tried to form a human chain to carry water from a nearby canal. The canal evaporated. The bodies, charred, continued to stand, fixed in an effort position, as if they were still trying to save something. The American strategy of attack by saturation did not target individual targets. It aimed at collapse, and he succeeded. The fire jumped from roof to roof like a virus, creating air vacuums that sucked oxygen from open windows. Many of those who did not burn to death died suffocated. The fire crawled through the narrow alleys and grew in a spiral, driven by the city's own thermal dynamics. People rushed to parks, temples and schools, considered safe areas. None resisted. The temple of Honjo was consumed in less than 15 minutes. In Sumida Park, thousands took refuge, only to see the trees burn simultaneously. Those who jumped into the Sumida and Arakawa rivers faced another sentence. The waters were already boiling. Bodies piled up on the banks, pushed by the current and despair. In lower areas of the city, where the population density was higher, entire families were found melted in basements, without air, surrounded by flaming walls. By 1:20 a.m., more than 100,000 homes had already been destroyed. The heat of the floor was so intense that it melted metallic objects. In some areas, temperatures reached 200 degrees, hotter than the melting point of aluminum, and even then, the bombers were still coming. Each successive wave expanded the perimeter of destruction, reaching areas where the population had not even realized what was approaching. The effect was cumulative. It wasn't just a fire, it was an entire city being consumed as fuel. Of the 279 planes that participated in the mission, 279 completed their launches. None were shot down by enemy fire. Japanese resistance was, in fact, nil. And yet, there were those who believed that Tokyo would resist. Japanese civil defense doctrine had been built on the idea of moral resilience. The ideal citizen would resist to the end, protect his family, help put out the flames with buckets and faith. But that night, morals were crushed by the method. Napalm left no room for heroism. It stuck, penetrated, burned from the inside out. The pumps were designed to infiltrate through the cracks of the houses and start the fire through the heart of the structure. It was reverse engineering applied to human behavior. Where there is shelter, there is focus. Where there is agglomeration, there is heat. Where there is despair, there is a loss of coordination. And where there is no oxygen, there is no choice. Germany had underestimated this type of war. As late as 1944, Luftwaffe officials ridiculed America's reliance on heavy technology and giant bombers. They called the B-29 a blind giant, powerful but vulnerable. They ignored that the US was producing 2,500 long-range aircraft per month, while Germany, that same year, could barely keep 300 fighters operational. They ignored that, while the Reich rationed aluminum, the Americans used it to build mess pans at their bases in the Pacific. American production of napalm in 1945 already exceeded 200,000 tons per month. Germany never manufactured 5,000 tons of any incendiary fuel in the entire war. If this difference impresses you, comment with absolute power, shocking data, or simply logistics wins. Because what was happening in Tokyo was not sadism, it was calculation. Around 2:45 a.m., the fire had consumed 40% of the urban area of the city. More than 1 million people were on the run, but there was nowhere to run. Every attempt at evacuation was thwarted by new outbreaks, new infrastructure collapses, and the growing collapse of the very idea of relief. Ambulances did not circulate. Hospitals were already on fire, the shelter centers had disappeared, and the meeting points marked by the civil defense were irretrievably erased, not for lack of order, but for lack of ground. The city collapsed physically and morally. In the next part, the viewer will see the dawn of March 10th, 1945. And why that day, marked by the silence of the survivors, was also the deadliest of the entire Second World War. More lethal than Nagasaki, more devastating than Dresden. The city breathed smoke. But the true statistic had not yet been counted. At 3:10 a.m., Tokyo was no longer a city, it was a living furnace. The phenomenon that American engineers had predicted based on physical data and field simulations was now manifesting itself on an urban scale. The firestorm. A firestorm fueled not by external fuel, but by the very oxygen of the environment, by the geometry of the streets, and by the material of the buildings. The heat generated by the incendiary bombs was so intense that it created updrafts of warm air, sucking in the colder air from the surroundings with violence. The result was an artificial wind, born of fire, which further fueled the fire. The flames stopped spreading in a linear rhythm and began to consume entire blocks in waves. Wind gusts reached 160 km/h, ripping off doors, windows, and even pieces of roof, throwing embers hundreds of meters away. The asphalt of the streets melted, tires exploded, windows burst due to thermal shock, roofs were torn from the bottom up, and in underground shelters, the thin air became lethal. Entire families, protected from the direct impact of the bombs, died suffocated by the lack of oxygen and the rise in ambient temperature to levels incompatible with human survival. The concept of the American operation was simple: destroy the city by heat, not impact, and each element had been calculated to work in synergy. Incendiary clusters were first launched in the central areas, where the streets were narrower and the population density higher. Then the outer rings were hit, preventing the advance of firefighters and blocking escape routes. The soil temperature was estimated at 800 degrees Celsius at some points. Wood spontaneously combusted. Paper, cloth, and food burned with no visible flame. The water from the pipes boiled inside the pipes. The parks have become fields of collective carbonization. Trees burned from the inside out due to the humidity that vaporized and broke through the bark in seconds. The bodies of civilians, when not incinerated, were found huddled together in defensive positions, protecting children and the elderly. What killed was not an explosion. It was the air. The fire crews, initially organized by blocks, were forced to abandon their positions. With no communication, no water pressure, and faced with a fire that moved faster than any vehicle could move, the officers ordered the evacuation of their own posts. A Japanese military report written weeks later describes the night as an unnatural calamity. And he was right. This was not an accidental disaster. It was the product of an equation: temperature, density, humidity, and wind direction. The Americans had simulated what would happen, and now they watched from the sky, through photographic lenses and thermal sensors, the experiment reach its climax. In evacuation centers, built in areas considered safe, the population crowded into gymnasiums, temples, and schools, but the hot air penetrated through the cracks, the doors, the vents. In less than 40 minutes, most of these centers became kilns. Thermometers marked more than 600 degrees indoors. In many cases, the bodies were not found. Only ash and remains fused to the concrete. Makeshift hospitals have become traps. The gauze masks, distributed by the authorities as protection against gas or smoke, stuck to the face and fused to the skin. At one of the railway stations, about 800 people took refuge in the underground tunnels. None survived. For the American military, all of this was evidence of operational success. Reports produced in the Mariana Islands, shortly after the return of the aircraft, spoke of exceptional efficiency of the incendiary system. Aerial photographs showed entire areas erased from the map, and the forecast for civilian casualties, previously estimated at 30,000, was updated to more than 80,000 in just the first few hours. By the end of the day, the number would exceed 100,000, the highest number of deaths in a single airstrike in history, more than Hiroshima, more than Nagasaki, and all with conventional pumps. The war there had been won with logistics, science, and repetition. The suffering, although immense, was not collateral. It was central. The irony is that Germany, up to that point, continued to underestimate American power. In letters intercepted by Allied intelligence, Luftwaffe officials insisted that American bombers were too slow, too visible, too fragile. They ignored that the real strength of the US was not the armor of the planes, but the speed of production. In 1945, while the Reich produced fewer than 300 planes per month, the United States exceeded 8,000. A single American factory, Willow Run, produced a B-24 bomber every 55 minutes. It was factory warfare versus trench warfare, and the factories were winning. The next morning, the sun rose over an unrecognizable city. Tokyo had no more form, only smoke, rubble, and silence. But for the Americans, the mission was not yet over. Engineers had more data to collect, more maps to review, more cities to apply the formula. And on LeMay's drawing boards, the next operation was already being designed. In the next part, the viewer will see how, in a matter of weeks, the same system would be replicated in more than 60 cities, transforming the art of war into a serial production standard. At the first light of March 10, 1945, the city of Tokyo did not wake up. It smoked. A residual heat still vibrated over the ground, as if the air hesitated to return to normality. The sky, grey and saturated, hid the sun and muffled the silence of a city that had ceased to exist in less than 6 hours. The smell of burning wood, charred flesh, and decaying fabrics formed an invisible haze. Government officials, accompanied by representatives of the military police and the Ministry of the Interior, walked through the rubble with damp cloth masks on their faces. The streets, now only furrows among mounds of ash, were lined with unrecognizable corpses, charred in escape poses, arms intertwined in final gestures of family protection. In some areas, there were no bodies, just dark spots on the ground, where the temperature had erased even identity. Preliminary reports indicated that more than 15 neighborhoods had been completely erased. The maps used by the authorities had to be redrawn, and the line that separated urban planning from the battlefield had been accurately eliminated. The official response from the Japanese government was immediate and fragile. A public statement described the attack as yet another attempt to morally destabilize the Japanese people, reiterating the need for resistance and sacrifice. But behind the scenes, the cables revealed another reality. Encrypted messages between the Imperial Army High Command and the Prime Minister's office indicated tactical confusion and administrative panic. In one of them, sent at 07:12 a.m., General Shunroku Hata described what happened as unknown in proportion and method, admitting that the physical destruction surpassed any previous attack simulation. Other messages begged for medical units, engineering equipment, and above all, fuel, a resource that no longer existed. The Navy refused immediate logistical support, claiming that its priorities were the coastal bases at Kure and Yokosuka under threat of future bombardment. For the first time, Japan's military institutions admitted, even if between the lines, that the capital had been defeated, not by armies, but by equations. The population, in turn, woke up to a world without reference. Many had spent the whole night trying to put out fires, rescue relatives, or simply run in circles. At train stations, lines formed for departures that would never leave. In schools, now transformed into deposits of bodies, mothers wrote names on the hands of their children in the hope of future identification. A woman was found hugging 3 children, all with wooden plaques tied around their necks, with dates of birth and blood groups scrawled in charcoal. In the midst of the physical collapse, something deeper collapsed: faith. The Japanese doctrine of honor, sacrifice, and absolute endurance was beginning to crumble in the face of a force that could not be met with sword, courage, or war cry. The enemy did not come in the form of soldiers. It came from the sky, packed in aluminum, timed by engineers, and guided by maps. The official propaganda tried to respond. Posters were pasted in the surviving areas calling for reconstruction and extolling the national spirit. But the contrast between the message and the reality was grotesque. There were no more bricks to stack, nor qualified labor to rebuild, and the national spirit had been buried under 1,665 tons of napalm. American intelligence monitored these reactions closely. Radio intercepts and diplomatic cables revealed the psychological impact of the attack. In a report by the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, one analyst writes, "Japan has begun to understand that it is fighting a factory, not an army." This observation broke with all the logic of war until then. It was no longer a struggle for territory, trenches, or tactical commands. It was the struggle between culture and production, between honor and serial number. In German military circles, the echoes of this change were also felt. In May 1945, shortly before the surrender of the Third Reich, an internal Luftwaffe report reviewed the bombing of Tokyo with growing concern. One of the excerpts said, "If this is applied to Germany, there will be no city with enough structure to resist for more than 72 hours." The phrase was not an exaggeration. Germany, which had bet on miraculous weapons such as the V2 and the Messerschmitt 262, now saw its doctrine threatened by something much simpler: quantity with method. For every rocket plane that the Reich produced, the Americans produced 1,000 bombers. For every ton of German explosive, the United States delivered 10 tons of napalm, kerosene, or white phosphorus, each designed for a specific type of devastation. Japan, still convinced that it could resist every last man, was undergoing a silent mutation. The people, once convinced that victory would come through morality, now sought explanations in practice. Why were there no air defenses? Why didn't the alarms sound in time? Why couldn't the bunkers withstand the heat? Internal distrust grew, and with it the feeling that the Central Command had lost control. It was the first visible crack in the pact of blind obedience to the Emperor, and it appeared not in a naval battle, nor in an amphibious landing, but in a fiery night that dissolved more than buildings. It dissolved certainties. The American response was silence. No celebration announcement, no triumphal speech, just the data, updated maps, aerial photographs, efficiency calculations. The engineers were already preparing the next mission, now aimed at Nagoya, and the ships continued to unload bombs, fuel, and parts. The machine did not stop, because she didn't need to stop to reflect. It just rotated, and with each rotation, a city disappeared. In the next part, the viewer will see how this machine was set in motion again, in more than 60 Japanese cities, and how war, once defined by heroes and battles, would come to be decided by performance metrics and production schedules. As Tokyo smoked under the still hot rubble, the routine at US bases in the Pacific followed with the precision of a timer. On Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, B-29 crews were greeted by maintenance technicians who were already waiting with inspection lists, checklists, and fueling schedules. The hangars functioned as reverse assembly line workshops. Each returning aircraft was disassembled, inspected, refueled, and reconfigured for the next mission, often in less than 48 hours. The losses from Operation Meeting House, while significant to the crew, did not alter the strategic plans. 14 planes did not return. But this number, on the American scale, was considered statistically negligible. In less than a week, 17 new B-29s would be delivered, straight from factories in Wichita, Nebraska, or Washington, crossing the United States by rail, then shipped by cargo ships and reassembled in the Pacific Islands. There was no mourning, there was a procedure. War for the United States was a sequence of operations, each measured in hours of labor, parts per unit, and fuel per mission. This pragmatism was present at all levels. Training of new crews continued in uninterrupted shifts at bases in California and Texas. As Tokyo burned, some 5,000 new aviation engineers were graduating that month, with specializations in navigation, ballistics, precision mechanics, and applied meteorology. The American war system didn't just produce armaments, it produced operators, technicians, analysts, and planners at an industrial pace. A War Department report, issued days after the attack, coolly stated, "The success of the mission validates the thermal saturation model. Repetition is recommended in high-density urban centers based on favorable climate data. There was no celebration, just continuity. American logistical planning allowed not only to maintain the war, it allowed for optimization. In Washington, the impact of the mission was met with technical interest, not euphoria. Meetings between the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, and Army Air Forces highlighted the effectiveness of the M69 incendiary bomb, the accuracy of the pathfinders, and above all, the reliability of the B-29s at low altitudes. The goal now was to standardize this attack model in other cities. New tables were developed, correlating the type of construction with combustion time, urban density with lethality rate, and relative humidity with fire resistance. It was a science of destruction, and the labs at Harvard University, MIT, and Caltech were all mobilized to perfect it. War, for Americans, was not a duel of will. It was a problem of scale, efficiency, and iterative learning. This approach contrasted sharply with the Japanese structure. While the United States adjusted variables in real time, Japan still operated with dogmas. The Japanese Empire hoped that the national spirit would compensate for the scarcity of materials, that individual heroism would replace mass production, and that tradition would contain the advance of technique. The reality, however, was different. Japanese aircraft production had plummeted. The engine was unable to keep up with demand, and the naval industry, bombed in the ports, could barely supply the islands with coal, steel, or ammunition. The Army and Navy competed with each other for resources and authority, without any strategic unification, and, more importantly, there was no way to copy the American Plan A. It depended on an economic, territorial, and technological structure that Japan simply did not have. While Japan tried to salvage what was left, the United States planned based on excess. The surplus of production allowed for risk, the excess of fuel allowed for detour, the abundance of personnel allowed for error. The Americans could test new altitudes, try different tactics, and even fail, because the system absorbed failures like a well-oiled gear. By March 1945, the United States had more than 70,000 operational planes on all combat fronts. Germany had fewer than 7,000, Japan less than 5,000, many of whom were on the ground for lack of parts or pilots. The war was no longer a dispute between armed forces, it was a dispute between accumulated capacities, and in that, the outcome was already written. The American Air Force, with its B-29s, was just the most visible face of this machine. But behind it were railroads, universities, shipyards, refineries, synthetic rubber industries, power grids, and laboratories. It was the first industrialized total war, and the United States, with its model of mobilized capitalism, had become a war powerhouse with a human face and mechanical efficiency. For every mission that set out from the Pacific, thousands of workers in Detroit, Cleveland, and Los Angeles had done their part, casting parts, assembling engines, testing instruments, packing munitions. There was no individual heroism in this process, but there was a result. And the result was all that mattered. The Germans had laughed at the idea of a war won by accountants and workers. One Nazi general even said, "America may have factories, but it has no soul to win a continental war." That phrase never came to LeMay's knowledge, but he didn't need to hear it. Every M69 cluster dropped on Tokyo was a response, and each new batch of bombs that arrived in the Mariana Islands was a reminder that war in the 20th century would be decided by those who knew how to turn statistics into strategy. In the next part, the viewer will see how this strategy was expanded and applied to not one, but 64 Japanese cities in just 5 months. A pattern of destruction so precise that it no longer needed moral justifications, only operational goals. In the days following the bombing of Tokyo, the Japanese Empire began to realize that it had lost more than one city. It had lost an entire generation of technical knowledge. In the charred alleys, among the wreckage of houses and workshops, lay not only civilians, but the last representatives of a production chain that took centuries to form. Artisans, blacksmiths, weavers, turners, and makers of essential components, all killed, scattered, or disabled. The Japanese urban working class had been built on oral transmission, hands-on learning, and a sense of community honor. There were not enough manuals or technical schools. What the Americans destroyed with fire was not just timber, it was an irreplaceable productive culture. Family workshops, which for generations had been manufacturing bicycle gears, engine valves, components for military radios, simply ceased to exist. And what the Japanese High Command soon realized is that no state factory, no matter how modern, could make up for that loss. The impact was not only physical, it was moral. The Japanese working class, once revered as the backbone of the war effort, began to crumble in silence. Displaced families had nowhere to live, let alone work. The secondary industrial zones, scattered around Tokyo, depended directly on the capital as a logistical and administrative axis. With it in ruins, production orders were halted, payments have ceased, and faith in the central command has crumbled. Intercepted letters from workers reported tiredness, hunger, disorientation, and above all, abandonment. Many migrated to the interior, others took refuge with relatives in agricultural regions, and a growing number simply disappeared from official statistics. For the first time, the empire saw its manpower disappear, not by weapons, but by the collapse of the structure that supported urban life. In contrast, the United States recorded the opposite. American industrial production not only continued to expand, but had reached, in 1945, an unprecedented level of national integration. Workers in Detroit produced chassis, in Pittsburgh special steel, in Long Beach aero engines, and in Seattle the set was assembled. All this with standardized quality control, rail logistics protected by the military, and an inexhaustible reserve of trained workers. More than 10 million Americans were directly employed in the industrial war effort, 3 million of them in the aeronautical sector alone. While Japan lost engineers and skilled workers to fire or starvation, the United States trained more than 100,000 technicians a month. If this data surprises you, comment below. Logistics wins. But the numbers don't stop there. Each month, the United States produced more steel than Japan had accumulated during the entire war. In 1945, the Americans manufactured 96,000 airplanes. Japan, less than 9,000, and of these a significant percentage were gliders, improvised kamikazes, or outdated models. The scales were not just military, it was structural. Japan struggled with the memory of a glorious past. The United States struggled with spreadsheets, schedules, and production records. It was the 20th century against the 19th century. The social disruption caused by the attack on Tokyo had immediate consequences on the Japanese military production chain. With the destruction of domestic manufacturing centers, simple items became rare: flashlights, boots, portable radios, spare parts. In many cases, tanks were stopped not for lack of ammunition, but for lack of bolts. Planes were on the ground because there was no specific valve or replacement gauge. The Japanese war, which was already suffering from fuel shortages, now faced a crueler enemy: the absence of technical continuity. And this absence could not be compensated with bravery. The doctrine that the national spirit could overcome the machine was beginning to be denied, piece by piece, cog by cog. The population, already exhausted by years of rationing, came to view the war effort with skepticism. What was once advertised as patriotic duty was now perceived as a useless sacrifice. Shortages affected not only the big cities, but the agricultural villages. Trains did not run. Stations did not work. Local authorities did not have the resources to distribute food or maintain order, and the rumors spread with the speed of fire. Tokyo, has fallen. There is no more government. The emperor fled. It was all exaggeration, but it all seemed plausible. Because in Japan, in March 1945, logic had dissolved into the ashes. In Germany, intelligence officials began to question the validity of their own calculations. In memos dated April, there is evidence that the Wehrmacht severely underestimated American logistical reach. A report from the High Command states, "We assumed that the Americans would need at least 6 months to recompose losses after a large-scale attack. We were wrong. In 6 days, they release another one." The incredulity was sincere. Germany, in collapse, no longer had fuel even to withdraw its troops from the Eastern Front. Japan, his ally, was now an island surrounded and stripped of its productive heart. With the collapse of the urban working class, Japan began to consider the use of teenagers and civilians in risky industrial activities. Schools were closed and students sent to factories. Girls as young as 14 operated hydraulic presses without training. Boys as young as 12 welded pieces with improvised masks. In Nagoya, a production supervisor reported, "We are working with children and the elderly. The men are gone." The war was devouring the future, and there was no hiding it anymore. But what would come next would make it clear that the destruction of Tokyo was no exception. She was the prototype, a replicable model, systematized and adapted to dozens of cities. And in the next part, the viewer will see how the same logistical hell fell on Osaka, Kobe, and 60 other Japanese cities, not as retaliation, but as a strategy. Because for America, winning the war was not a matter of glory. It was a matter of process. In the Tokyo night sky, as the city burned under a carpet of fire, scattered groups of Japanese fighters tried to intercept the invisible enemy. They were fast planes but fragile. Many were Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa or Mitsubishi A6M0 models, designed for agile combat, not for night interceptions at altitude. With no onboard radar, few functional observation posts on the ground, and flying under a sky obscured by clouds of smoke and soot, Japanese pilots flew blind. Imperial air doctrine, built around individual skill and courage in aerobatic maneuvers, simply had no answer to the cold logic of American bombing. The B-29s did not fly in formation, did not maintain predictable patterns, and operated at altitudes that many Japanese fighters could barely reach. And on this mission, they had purposely descended to increase the impact of the bombs, becoming targets, but unreachable. Testimonies collected after the war reveal the psychological abyss experienced by Japanese pilots that night. A young lieutenant, Yoshito Kuroda, reported, "I climbed as high as I could. The radio said they were there, but all I saw was smoke, and then lights on the ground, no planes, no chance." Others reported cannon shots that did not reach the distance, sights that failed in low visibility, and even cases of mechanical collapses due to the overheating of the turbines, a result of improvised maintenance and lack of parts. One of the pilots, after landing, threw his helmet against the wall and said, "It's not a war, it's a massacre with a fixed time." This impotence was compounded by the fact that many of these men had been trained to die as kamikazes. But there, they couldn't even catch up with the enemy. The absence of integrated airborne radar was fatal. By 1945, Japan had fewer than 30 functional radars covering the archipelago, with limited range and low accuracy. The United States, on the other hand, had turned radar into a natural extension of its air doctrine. Each squadron operated in sync with weather data, electronic intelligence information, and up-to-date tactical maps. Confrontation in the air was no longer between men, it was between systems, and the Japanese were fighting with flashlights against computers. This asymmetry was not only technological, it was ideological. The core belief of Japanese aviation was that rigorous training and a spirit of sacrifice would make up for any material disadvantage. But this applied to duels, not mass attacks conducted with algorithmic precision. The B-29s, weighing more than 60 tons, armored with 11 50-caliber machine guns and engines that absorbed multiple damage without losing altitude, were simply unattainable under normal conditions. Japanese bullets ricocheted, the attacks were uncoordinated, and when a pilot did manage to fire, his armament often failed. Imperial aviation, once a symbol of the attack on Pearl Harbor, now watched helplessly as its own capital was destroyed. From the sky, but unable to react. This doctrinal clash spread quickly among the commands of the Japanese Air Force. In internal reports, intelligence officials described the American bombers as ghosts of steel and suggested that their destruction would be possible only with extraordinary methods. This paved the way for a new escalation. The systematic use of suicide attacks against bombers as well, a desperate doctrine that, while popularized as an act of faith, was in fact the implicit recognition that there was no technical alternative. Courage alone had failed. The humiliation was visible. Entire airfields began to operate quietly, with empty hangars, frustrated pilots, and officers hastily trying to rewrite manuals. Japan still believed that victory would come from the heart. But the heart did not see in the dark, it did not detect targets, it did not calculate escape routes. And the enemy was now doing all of this without hesitation. A phrase attributed to a veteran pilot, recorded in a personal diary, sums up the crisis. "We are flying against the future, and our wings are made of paper." Meanwhile, the United States analyzed every move, every failure, every absence of reaction. High-altitude photographic reconnaissance planes flew over Japan in the hours following the attacks, recording the damage and the military response. In reports sent to General LeMay, analysts stated, "Air resistance is statistically negligible. The Japanese sky is operationally open," a declaration that in itself redefined the war in the Pacific. If the sky is open, war ceases to be combat. It becomes surrender. And the Americans were ready to deliver more. In German technical circles, the situation was also observed with increasing discomfort. In a memorandum intercepted by the Allies in April 1945, a Luftwaffe engineer writes, "If the B-29s operate over Berlin as they did over Tokyo, we have no defensive response." This phrase, although never officially confirmed, circulated among OSS analysts and reinforced a perception. The Germans had underestimated the real potential of the American doctrine. They expected a war of attrition. They received a war of process. The difference wasn't just in the planes, it was in the mindset. In the next part, the viewer will see the brutal unfolding of this mentality, how the United States replicated the Tokyo model in dozens of Japanese cities with mathematical precision and operational constancy. It was no longer a war to win. It was a sequence of operations to finish. Because, for those who control the sky and produce without pause, victory is no longer a matter of whether, but when. Modern warfare reached a tipping point when science ceased to be a support and became a weapon, and Operation Meeting House is the most striking proof of this transformation. In the United States, physicists, chemists, meteorologists, and economists worked side by side with generals, breaking the boundary between laboratory and battlefield. The M69 incendiary bomb was born not from the instinct of a commander, but from chemical formulas developed by researchers at Standard Oil and Harvard University, tested over and over again in perfect replicas of Japanese neighborhoods erected at the Dugway Proving Ground. Meteorologists calculated surface winds, air saturation, and urban thermal behavior as accurately as pilots calculated revolutions per minute. Economists, on the other hand, didn't just estimate costs, they determined the optimal napalm production cadence, evaluated Japanese industrial impact by sector, and suggested attacks that maximized logistical damage with the least operating expense. Nothing was random. Every street in Tokyo had been studied, catalogued, and classified according to density, incendiary potential, and population flow. War was no longer a duel of bravery. It became an equation. The contrast with Japan was profound. While the United States integrated science, industry, and strategy, Japan still leaned on Bushido traditions, the belief that discipline and sacrifice would make up for any material inferiority. Internal Japanese intelligence reports found after the war show bewilderment at American efficiency. One of them states, "The enemy fights with numbers and instruments. We fight with spirit. And the spirit does not alter the direction of the wind." The phrase summarizes the rupture. The United States had turned climate, geography, and human behavior into calculating variables. Japan insisted on treating them as a destination. While American physicists studied how napalm spread on different types of wood, Japanese engineers were still betting on reinforcing roofs with clay, believing that it would slow the fire. While mathematicians assessed how many minutes it took for a thermal storm to form, Japan trained civilian brigades with buckets of sand. The asymmetry was so great that even before the attack on Tokyo, some American analysts already considered the war technically won. The transformation from scientist to soldier was evident in the Army Air Force's own reports. Calculations of optimal launch height, submunition distribution, ignition time, and propagation velocity were debated with the same importance as air tactics. Men like James Conant, president of Harvard, or Louis Fieser, the chemist responsible for the development of napalm, had a direct impact on the results of the campaign, not through experimental weapons, but through precision use of existing weapons. Even the economists of the War Production Board played a decisive role. It was they who determined the feasibility of producing 50,000 tons of incendiary bombs per month and keeping them in continuous flow until August 1945. This ability to adjust variables on a national scale made it possible for the United States to turn the bombing of Tokyo not into an exception, but into a model. Japan had no way to keep up. His scientific production was fragmented, isolated, and often sabotaged by internal disputes between the Army and Navy. Research that could have improved radar, sound detectors, or civil protection mechanisms was neglected in favor of symbolic weapons, such as suicide squads or aeronautical projects aimed more at morale than actual effectiveness. Faith in individual courage blinded the Japanese command to the fact that the war had shifted to a field where courage does not create steel, does not produce fuel, and does not alter weather forecasts. Japanese universities, once vibrant centers of physics and engineering, were hollowed out by forced recruitment. Meanwhile, in the US, undergraduate students operated as research aides in military laboratories, contributing directly to the war effort. War became a contest between ecosystems, and the American ecosystem was unparalleled. Operation Meeting House symbolizes exactly this transition. It was not the apex of violence, but the apex of technical integration. The firestorm that consumed Tokyo was not a work of chance, but the logical result of calculations made months earlier. The predominant type of construction, the width of the streets, the direction of seasonal winds, the scarcity of air defenses, the behavior of the civilian population, and even the capacity of local firefighters had been considered. The attack didn't just inflict destruction, it proved that industrial warfare had reached maturity. They also proved that after a certain point, defeat was not a matter of courage, but of structure, and Japan had already lost this structure long before the first bomb touched the ground. This new era would not be reversed. On the contrary, it was just beginning. In the next part, we will see how this fusion of science and war would pave the way for a weapon that no longer relied on wind, wood, or fire. A weapon that would push the doctrine of planned destruction to the ultimate limit of human engineering. The device that would turn seconds into ages. The world awoke to the news of the attack on Tokyo, as if watching from a distance the inauguration of a new era, an era in which war ceased to be a dispute of armies and became a dispute of civilizational capabilities. In the UK, veterans from Coventry and London immediately understood the significance of what they saw in the first aerial photographs. It wasn't just destruction, it was efficiency. British reports described the attack as the most successful incendiary operation ever executed by an air force, but also as a grim warning about the future of Allied strategy. For Churchill, who closely followed every report coming from the Pacific, Tokyo represented both a victory and a moral frontier, because what had happened there no longer depended on the pilots' courage, but on science applied in a systematic way. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them, to understand that the total war would be won not by the individual hero, but by the laboratory and the factory. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support, like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. In Germany, the reaction was even deeper. When Berlin analyzed what had happened in Tokyo, its strategists understood what Hitler refused to admit. The fate of the Reich was sealed long before the Red Army crossed the Oder. An internal Luftwaffe report, dated April 1945, said with desperate frankness, "If such an attack is conducted against our cities, no shelter, no civil mobilization, and no faith can reverse the outcome." This observation did not come from morals, but from mathematics. Germany had produced 12,000 tons of incendiary bombs in the entire war. The United States, in 1945, produced more than 50,000 per month. The lesson was brutal. You cannot defeat a country that transforms war into an industrial process. Even the Soviet Union, accustomed to human losses and destruction on a colossal scale, saw in the attack on Tokyo something more than a simple military event. Stalin understood that American air power had reached a strategic level that no other country could match at that time. For Moscow, Meeting House was not just an attack. It was a theatrical demonstration of the distance between the powers. The Soviet Union watched closely the methods, results, and speed of the operation, realizing with discomfort that while it sacrificed millions of soldiers in ground battles, the United States could erase an enemy capital without landing a single man. Neutral Europe, for its part, interpreted the attack as an unmistakable signal that the post-war era would be dominated by whoever controlled the sky and technology. Commentary in Swiss newspapers described Tokyo as the first urban laboratory of total destruction, while questioning the moral limits of industrialized warfare. The question began to arise with unease. If the United States could destroy an entire city with conventional fire, what will happen when it develops something even more advanced? And this question was more real than the world imagined. The connection between Meeting House and the future of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not accidental. In the War Department archives, discussions of destructive scalability show that the arson attack served in effect as a preliminary study for something bigger. Understanding how urban populations reacted to instantaneous destruction, how systems collapsed, how governments became disorganized, and what kind of psychological impact determined the surrender of an enemy country. The bombing of Tokyo provided cruelly data. Manhattan Project engineers followed these reports closely, not because they wanted to repeat the firestorm, but because they needed to understand how cities behaved under extreme heat, sudden atmospheric pressure, displacement of air masses, and collapse of infrastructure, exactly the variables that a nuclear weapon would require. And herein lies the deepest historical irony of this narrative. The largest arson massacre in human history would be eclipsed a few months later by two guns that were still being assembled quietly in the American deserts. Tokyo was the pinnacle of conventional destruction. Hiroshima would be the beginning of something the world could not yet name. Meanwhile, the nations watched helplessly. European diplomats sent telegrams describing Tokyo as a glimpse of the future that no one wants, and foreign ministers began quietly discussing whether the era of vulnerable cities had come to an end, except that she had just begun. Operation Meeting House showed the world that industrial warfare could be absolute, but it also revealed something more unsettling. There was room to go further, and in the next part, we'll look at how this realization, that destruction could be calculated, escalated, and even standardized, influenced history-changing decisions in August 1945, when the Tokyo fire would be replaced by a light that would extinguish entire ages in seconds. Japan woke up after the March 10 bombing, facing not only ruins, but the quiet collapse of its own military identity. For decades, the ruling elite had cultivated the belief that the warrior spirit, Bushido reinterpreted, could make up for any technological disadvantage. This faith had guided strategic decisions from the invasion of Manchuria to Pearl Harbor, and it fueled the conviction that victory would come by force of will, not steel. But Tokyo, now reduced to ashes by an operation conducted as if it were an urban-scale scientific experiment, revealed the definitive bankruptcy of this doctrine. In the corridors of the Ministry of War, memos began to circulate with an urgency that bordered on panic. Officials acknowledged in veiled language that the nation was facing a force whose method surpasses our military structure. Structure, not courage, was the problem. Germany had learned this lesson too late, and now Japan was repeating its mistakes, preparing for a heroic war when the enemy was preparing for an industrial war. Within the Japanese leadership, the fractures were increasing. The army blamed the navy blamed the army, and both blamed the population for moral weakness. Neither service admitted that the real failure lay in its inability to modernize the country before the war, a modernization that would require massive investment, industrial standardization, and mastery of technologies that Japan possessed only in a piecemeal form. The refusal to understand that the war in the Pacific would be won by logistics, fuel, and production rather than bravery created a chasm between the real Japan and the imagined Japan. The High Command insisted that new air defense tactics could counter the B-29s. He ignored that the country did not have the capacity to produce modern radars, powerful engines, or enough ammunition to maintain a prolonged campaign. Japanese doctrine still treated combat as ritual, while the United States treated combat as a process. And the process does not give way in the face of myths. The internal debates after the attack reveal the depth of this crisis. In March 1945, a meeting between army generals recorded the phrase, "We have no instruments to fight the war we face, we are fighting the war we want." The Navy, pressured by the failure of its air forces, argued that the country should concentrate resources on decisive weapons, such as kamikazes and midget submarines. The Army, for its part, bet on civilian mobilizations and urban resistance, ignoring that Tokyo had just proved that there was no possible resistance in the face of an incendiary bombing on a continental scale. The ideological clash became even more evident among young officers, who understood, belatedly, that they were serving in a military machine that did not keep up with the times. Many knew that the United States produced more steel per month than Japan produced in a year, and that half of Japan's factories depended on makeshift home workshops. It was a war between an industrial nation and an island that was trying to be an empire, and this attempt would be costly. Records from the affected provinces show that the psychological impact exceeded the physical damage. Workers began to abandon factories, convinced that the government had no means of protecting them. Aware that domestic production, the backbone of Japan's arms industry, had disappeared in the smoke of Tokyo, many artisans accepted that the war was lost, even if the command insisted otherwise. Official radio spoke of minor damage, while millions realized that their cities could disappear in a few hours. Trust in the military leadership evaporated. The population understood that the enemy was not just attacking, it was dismantling the very logic of the country's functioning. For the first time, ordinary Japanese wondered not if Japan would win, but how long it would still exist. The Japanese doctrine had not only failed in the technical field, had failed in the moral field. By insisting that sacrifice would solve material problems, the command ignored that no amount of sacrifice produces aluminum, creates engines, or builds factories. Japanese military romanticism, so useful for creating soldiers willing to die, was useless for facing bombers built by thousands of skilled workers operating on gigantic assembly lines coordinated by engineers, mathematicians, and planners. Japan bet on belief. The United States bet on the calculation. And calculus proved to be the most devastating weapon of war. An American intelligence analyst wrote, after studying the Japanese response, "Japan struggles with traditions. We struggle with systems. Systems don't get tired." This phrase sums up why the bombing of Tokyo was not just an attack. It was the ultimate demonstration that Japan was waging the wrong war, with the wrong tools, against the wrong adversary. And there was still a more bitter lesson ahead. The destruction of Tokyo was not the end, but the beginning of a campaign that would become routine. Each week, another city would fall. Each month, another part of the Japanese industrial structure would disappear. In the next part, we will see how this methodical sequence of bombings, fueled by the American production machine, turned the Japanese archipelago into a laboratory of national collapse, revealing that the final defeat was already mathematically and inevitably sealed. When the B-29 engines fell silent and the firestorm wind ceased, Tokyo remained in a silence that was not peace. It was absence. In the days following the operation, voices emerged that rarely appear on military maps or in strategic reports. Mothers carrying children wrapped not in blankets but in soot. Firefighters walking down streets where hoses had become molten rubber streamers. Elderly people who were looking for the shadows of houses that no longer existed. One of these reports came from a young woman named Yoshiko, who decades later still described the night with the precision of someone who relives it daily. The city went up in smoke. My baby breathed warmth. When the sky lit up, it seemed as if the world was falling apart. There were also children who never understood the attack as part of the war. To them, fire was just something that came from heaven, and heaven never again became a place of hope. Some spent years in fear of the rain, because the sound of the drops reminded them of the impact of incendiary bombs on the roof. Others slept in wet clothes in an attempt to calm the terror of the heat, a heat that no longer lodged in the skin, but in the memory. The surviving firefighters also carried invisible scars. Many reported that when they closed their eyes, they still heard the simultaneous rupture of hundreds of structures, as if the entire city was breathing in agony. One of them wrote, "We didn't fight fire. We tried to decide which direction to run." And so a national memory was created made of fragments. A father who held the hand of a son, but lost sight of his wife in the smoke. A grandmother who tried to protect a grandson while the air disappeared. Entire families who went to the banks of rivers where the fire met the water and the water boiled. The trauma didn't end when the fires went out. It has infiltrated Japanese routine. On nights when blackouts seem to be harbingers, on sirens that have been reinstalled in post-war cities, on children's cartoons depicting roofless homes, and on how the entire country has had to learn to rebuild not just buildings, but meaning. Many survivors kept silent for decades, out of shame, out of guilt, because they believed their stories were not big enough to compose the narrative of a war marked by heroic battles and nuclear bombs. Meeting House did not have the mythical power of Hiroshima, nor the symbolic value that the world associated with Japanese surrender. It was destruction too human, too everyday, too close to be transformed into glory. Thus, it remained a domestic memory, preserved in diaries, in local museums, in whispered conversations between grandparents and grandchildren. Japanese society faced a kind of collective mourning that could not be translated into monuments or celebrations. It was a mourning for the lost streets, the destroyed crafts, the broken families, and the feeling that the city itself had been torn from history and replaced by a void. Post-war psychologists recorded traces of trauma that would echo for generations. Difficulty sleeping, fear of sudden light, aversion to the smell of smoke. And yet, Tokyo rebuilt itself. Not because the pain was small, but because survival required reorganizing the country from scratch, recovering what the war had destroyed: trust, work, continuity. The historical irony is that the tragedy that should have become a worldwide symbol remained overshadowed by future attacks that would use similar principles of destructive calculation on an even larger scale. While Hiroshima and Nagasaki entered the global consciousness for the uniqueness of the atomic bomb, Tokyo was left on the sidelines, as if the absence of a nuclear explosion made its devastation less worthy of memory. But among the survivors, the memory has not faded. They knew that in that early morning Japan did not only lose lives, it has lost part of its own urban soul. And history still held one last irony. The world forgot Tokyo, but American strategists did not. Behind the scenes of military planning, the human impact observed in the Japanese capital would be one of the key pieces in deciding what would come in the following months. Because there it was understood, with brutal clarity, how a society reacts when the heat of the sky redefines the limit of what is bearable. In the next part, we will see how this understanding, born in fire and silence, would influence the final decision that would forever change the course of war and humanity. In the early hours of March 10th, 1945, something ended in Japan, and it wasn't just the city of Tokyo. The illusion that the nation still had a strategic margin to resist ended. The belief that domestic production, even if fragmented, could sustain the war ended. The doctrine that collective morality could challenge an enemy whose power came not from the battlefield, but from the factory, the laboratory, and continental logistics ended, when the first lights of day revealed 8 square miles of ruins. Japanese authorities initially tried to interpret the disaster as one more tragic episode among many. But as industrial reports began to come in, reality imposed itself like a sentence. The capital's productive capacity had been crushed beyond repair. Entire workshops responsible for electrical components, aircraft parts, precision instruments, had disappeared within hours. For a country that depended on these small units to maintain the war machine, the impact was fatal. The United States, for its part, immediately understood the strategic significance of this moment. Reports from the Army Air Forces sent to LeMay and the High Command stated that Japan had reached its operational breaking point. One of these documents reads, "From this date, Japanese resistance must be considered mathematically unfeasible, except for external intervention." It was not bravado. It was calculation. Over the next few days, the Incendiary campaign advanced to Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other cities. With each attack, thousands of small factories, many of them located in homes, disappeared. Japanese production, which was already operating at the limit, collapsed in entire sectors: light metallurgy, optics, electronics, industrial fabrics, aeronautical components. Modern warfare demands continuity, and Japan had lost hers. Meanwhile, the United States demonstrated the industrial elasticity that had defined its entire strategy. The B-29s lost at Meeting House were replaced in less than 2 weeks. The incendiary bombs, consumed on an unprecedented scale, were replaced by factories that operated day and night, and American planners, now confident, began to anticipate scenarios through statistical models that projected Japan's total collapse for the third quarter of 1945, even without a ground invasion. The bombing of Tokyo, in this sense, even reconfigured the logic of Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the archipelago. Some generals argued that it would not be necessary to mobilize 1 million troops if the systematic destruction of Japanese cities was already deconstructing the country from the inside out. There were those who openly argued that conventional warfare had already fulfilled its role, and that Japan could be forced to surrender before the United States risked the lives of ground troops. This strategic reading would create a direct link with decisions that would be made in the summer of that same year. Overseas, military analysts soon realized that Meeting House had ushered in a new order. The attack demonstrated for the first time that the destruction of a modern metropolis could be achieved with statistical accuracy. The collapse of Tokyo was not seen as an isolated tragedy, but as definitive proof that whoever controls air power and industrial production controls the destiny of nations. This logic, the same one that would shape the Cold War, was born there, among ashes, wind, and napalm. The firebombing of Tokyo transformed war into a science of social dismantling. To destroy factories was to destroy labor. To destroy work was to destroy morale. To destroy morale was to destroy the ability to fight. And by demonstrating this equation in practice, the United States understood that it possessed more than superior weapons. It possessed the method to end any conflict whose enemy logistics could be mapped and attacked. For Japan, the night of March 10th marked the end of a century of imperial ambitions. Its armed forces would continue to fight, but without the industrial backbone, without the confidence of the population, and without the real possibility of recovery. The war would still last 5 months, but the defeat, in structural terms, was already consummated. Official propaganda still preached resilience, still spoke of 10,000 years of glory, but even high commanders knew that they were only managing the inevitable. An internal Japanese document released after the war states, "If the enemy repeats in other cities what it did in Tokyo, our military capability will cease to exist before the middle of the year." The enemy repeated it. Capacity has ceased. And Japan, exhausted, entered a spiral of survival, while the United States moved forward with almost mathematical confidence. Still, the story has one last layer. Meeting House did not end the war, but it did end the discussion about which model of warfare would define the 20th century. Not the duel between armies, but the planned collapse of societies. A logic that, just 5 months later, would be taken to the extreme by a weapon that condensed in seconds everything that had been tested in Tokyo. Heat, shock, urban collapse, and death on a scale. And it is exactly this transition from fire to atom that leads us to the conclusion of this narrative, where the final question is no longer why Tokyo fell, but why the world almost forgot the night the 20th century actually began. On the pale morning that followed the bombing, as Tokyo smoked under a silence that seemed to suspend time, it became impossible to deny what that night had revealed to the world. Japan had been defeated not only by bombs, but by the brutal clash between two visions of war, that of myth and that of the machine. Operation Meeting House exposed the end of an era in which courage, sacrifice, and honor were treated as strategic resources. As Germany would learn weeks later, no ideal, no matter how heroic, could compete with the ability of an enemy to produce planes faster than they could shoot them down, rebuild arsenals before reports arrived, and turn science into military force with the precision of those who turn numbers into destiny. The Japanese collapse was, in essence, the same collapse that was already eating away at the Reich. The belated recognition that modern warfare was not fought in the spiritual field, but in the industrial field. The doctrine that sustained Tokyo, like that sustained Berlin, fell apart in the face of the realization that the real power lay not in the minds of the soldiers, but in the scale of the factories, in logistical continuity, and in the ability to improve methods with engineering. Coolness. If there was a definitive truth that dawn burned on the Japanese map and memory, it was this: no nation can win when it fights with centuries of tradition against minutes of production. The universal lesson of this episode remains current in wars, industries, and economies. Logistics determines the strategy. Volume trumps tactics. Systems win where individuals only resist. History does not favor those who fight with more passion, but those who control more resources, adapt faster, and understand that war is won better in calculation than in combat. The firestorm that consumed Tokyo was the embodiment of this harsh rule, revealing that modernity would not wait for old codes of honor to catch up. Japan, like Germany, discovered too late that you don't face an industrial enemy with faith. You fight with structures, science, numbers, and production. And it was a German officer, observing the ruin of his own country before the American machine, who summed up this bitter irony: "We were defeated by trucks, not by tanks, not by planes, by trucks." A simple confession, but one that contains all the logic that will define the 20th century, the logic that began, irrefutably, that early morning in Tokyo. If you value this type of deep research and the relentless search for historical truth, leave your like and subscribe to strengthen our work. Comment on the most shocking fact in this story: the scale of the attack, the Japanese fragility, or the coldness of the calculations that made it possible. Activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact that we are going to reveal. Because, as this narrative showed, history only seems distant until the moment we understand its numbers, its causes, and its consequences. And don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel, where another incredible and equally decisive truth waits to be unveiled.